Hello, and welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the studios of KALW San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that began at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus.
Today, meaning in the American Revolution.
Hey, Ken, shouldn't that be the meaning of the American Revolution? You're not saying we're going to talk about something as boring as the meanings of words in the face of something so glorious as the American Revolution.
Well, we're going to talk about both the words and the event. We're going to talk about the key documents of the American Revolution and the formation of the United States. There's the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They're, of course, written in words, and their meanings are taken to provide the essence to lots of people of what America is all about, and to be in some sense binding on all of us.
Well, you're certainly right about that. I mean, you might wonder what a bunch of dead people a couple hundred years ago have to say to us, but in fact, their words are appealed to by the Supreme Court justices in their opinions, by politicians in their campaigns, and pundits in their commentaries.
So it's worth asking, it's highly worth asking, what do these words mean? How do we know what they mean, and what do we mean? What do we mean, the pundits, the politicians, and all those folks you mentioned, and also us ordinary citizens? What do we mean in asking what they mean or meant?
What you're telling us is we are going to talk about the boring thing. But what about the interesting thing, the meaning of America?
Well, you can't just talk about the meanings of words. You have to consider what the people who wrote them meant, what they were up to, their intentions, their aspirations, the hopes and dreams of the founding fathers and the people they rallied to the barricades.
Okay, I think I get it. Now, let's go back to the boring thing. It's starting to get interesting to me. I mean, I see two kinds of problems.
Tell me, what are your problems?
Well, the first is what I'll call a problem of myths and missing words. I bet you can figure out what that is.
Yeah, I think I got your drift here, because we constantly hear, for example, that the United States is a Christian nation. But the official founding documents, the Constitution, for example, doesn't even contain the word God or Christ or Christian. The word religion occurs, but it occurs only once in the First Amendment, saying there isn't going to be an official religion.
Of course, in the Declaration of Independence, the words God and the Creator do occur.
Yeah, but in a pretty weird kind of way, if you think about it. The word God appears in the phrase, the laws of nature and of nature's God. The endower of our rights isn't called God, but their creator. It doesn't sound to me like it's the God of the Old Testament or even the New Testament that's being appealed to, but really the God of the Enlightenment, which was actually reason.
I mean, good point. And that connects our two questions, right? What did the founding fathers mean, and what did they intend? Was it just so obvious to them that the U.S. was a Christian nation that it didn't need to be mentioned? Or were there careful words in the Declaration and the kind of absence of words in the Constitution a way of steering between the desires of atheists, humanist agnostics, deists, Puritans, Anglicans, and Catholics?
So that's the first problem. What's the second problem you have?
Well, I actually think, and I'm sure you agree as a philosopher of language, that it's a little harder to figure out what these documents mean than people sometimes think.
Well, the Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia doesn't think so. He's famous for emphasizing that we need to look at the original meanings in the text of the Constitution and other laws to interpret them. But I guess you're saying that it's not so obvious or simple as it seems. It's not like you can just read the words and their meanings just pop out to you. But give me an example.
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Scalia. It sounds like you should look at the meanings the words had when they were written, and it's pretty easy to figure out what those words mean. Take the Eighth Amendment, for example. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Now, you can look up all those words in Webster's 1828 Dictionary of the American English, which was started, he started working on it just soon after these documents were written, and you can go back to Dr. Johnson's Dictionary of 1755 to double check. And these are pretty straightforward words. So that part is fairly easy.
We're philosophers, John. And as philosophers, take the phrase cruel and unusual. I mean, that's a funny phrase, and that's enough to make any philosopher suspicious. Does that mean punishments aren't allowed if they're both cruel and unusual? Or there's a way of reading it that they're not allowed if they're either cruel or unusual. This is the sort of thing that a dictionary really can't tell you, because the words can be used either way, and they are used either way.
Yeah, they say the devil's in the details, but as philosophers of language, we believe the devil's in the phrases, right?
Well, there you go.
I mean, let's shift to a different answer. What were the framers worried about with the word cruel? I mean, what's being disallowed is cruel actions. But you can't get a dictionary to tell you what a cruel action is. It'll tell you what a cruel person is. What were they worried about? The sorts of torture devices used in Spain and France? The abuses of Charles II? Were they just repeating ideas from the Glorious Revolution? Did they have something specific in mind? Or was cruel and unusual just a sort of code phrase or idiom they picked up?
Well, I think both of our issues, both the meaning of the Constitution and the meanings embodied in the Constitution, are really fascinating. And as usual, we have an expert to help our discussion along.
And that would be Jack Rakove. Jack is the author of the Annotated U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence, the relevance of which is pretty obvious. He's recently the author of Revolutionaries, a new history of the invention of America, and a little while ago of the Pulitzer Prize winning book Original Meanings, which is right on our topic.
But first, our roving philosophical reporter, Angela Kildolf, talks to some folks who have firm opinions about the meaning of the American Revolution. She files this report.
TV personality Glenn Beck recently focused a series of shows on America's founding fathers.
You're going to learn more in an hour than you probably learned about American history whole time in school.
As he writes on two old-fashioned chalkboards, Beck says Americans want to know who the founders really were. And setting the record straight means these men are an example for us today.
If you ever get frustrated or down in your life, if you ever think, I don't know, we're not going to make it, the Tea Parties, you just read about George Washington. George Washington lost every single battle he fought for over a year. During the opening stages of the war, loser.
That loser is the man in the powdered wig on the dollar bill. You know, the father of our country. And the Tea Party, of course, isn't the one in Boston in 1773. It's the movement gaining traction across the U.S. today.
And show 'em that you're proud to be American. Tell me what kind of party. A Tea Party. Tell me what kind of party.
In Northern California, some of the Tri-City Tea Party patriots talked about Glenn Beck's take on revolutionary history.
I thought it was excellent. He was giving us education that I know for myself, haven't had since school.
Chuck Castagnolo.
The Constitution, in my opinion, is a concrete document. It is not a living, breathing document, as some of our representatives seem to believe.
Like Chuck said, I think it is a concrete document, and it's not just this administration, but others previous.
Chris Pareja wasn't politically active before he joined the Tea Party, unless yelling at the television counts. Now he's running as a write-in candidate in California's 13th Congressional District. Pareja is careful to define the movement's goals.
It's about regaining control of out-of-control spending. It's about a return to constitutional rule of government. And it's about free market systems and the ability for people to actually create the life that they want to create.
That's the message of the National Tea Party Federation. But how you get there is a matter of dispute within the movement.
People fight about whether healthcare is good or bad in its current form. They fight about how much government is too much. Some like Social Security, some don't. Some like Medicare, some don't.
And politicians are paying attention. The first Tea Party caucus met in the House this summer, and more than 50 representatives joined. Yet Pareja says the movement faces many misconceptions.
It's been called a racist movement. It's been called a bunch of three-cornered hat-wearing, paranoid, old rich white guys, and it's been called an arm of the Republican Party, etc. But what you'll find is it's more like a family picnic with an educational component.
Marla Castagnolo agrees.
You know, it's not radicals, it's not crazy people, it's just people like you and me. I was a homemaker and a mother, and all of a sudden now I'm a person into politics.
She founded the Tri-City Tea Party Patriots after realizing how many people in her area shared her concerns. Now, there are more than 60 members.
I think what we're finding is that the citizenry is committed, and they're waking up in larger and larger numbers, and that hopefully we can just get the accountability back to where it needs to be and the way that the country was founded as designed by the Founding Fathers.
When I get frustrated about what's taking place today, I look back to the American Revolution and I think those people fought. It wasn't just something that happened easily for them. They had to fight for it. We have to fight for it too.
We gotta do what's right before all of our freedom. Stand and fight before all of our freedom. Do what's right before all of our freedom's gone.
For Philosophy Talk, I'm Angela Kilduff.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. And today we're joined by Jack Rakove. He's a professor of history and American studies at Stanford University. He's author of lots of things, two things pertinent to our current topic: original meanings, politics and the ideas in the making of the Constitution, and more recently, Revolutionaries, a new history of the invention of America. Jack, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Happy to be here, Ken and John.
So, Jack, Tell us briefly how a nice young man from Chicago became a Pulitzer Prize winning historian.
Briefly, when I was back in graduate school, I started thinking about the issue. And this is in the early 1970s. People were talking about what did the Constitution originally mean at that point in the early 1970s. It had to do with war powers. It had to do with impeachment. It had to do mostly with issues relating to national security. And I started thinking about that question, which is being mostly discussed in legal reviews and law journals. And I started thinking this is really a historian's kind of question. What a document originally meant, whatever use you might make of dictionaries, as you referred to earlier, also has to be a function of how language is used actively in the course of decision making and deliberation. So therefore, there should be a kind of historian's method to think about what did the documents originally mean that would bring something different to the table from what I thought law professors or philosophers, for that matter, or students of literature might bring. It would really require some kind of immersion in the kinds of sources that historians regularly use.
Well, I'm really glad you had that thought and went in that direction. Now, a lot of political discourse does seem to involve, as we just heard from the roving philosophical reporter, not appeals to the wisdom or consequences of policy, but to the fact that it's what the founding fathers did or didn't intend for us. But as Ken and I mentioned, some things attributed to the founding fathers aren't necessarily there in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Do you agree with this, and can you give us some more examples?
It's hard to know where to begin. For starters, I think what I want to say is, there are multiple uses of the Constitution, and there's the kind of work that historians do. There's the kind of rhetorical appeals that political leaders make. There's the special kind of inquiries that lawyers and jurists have been conducting. And then, of course, there's the kind of appeal which the Tea Party movement represents, where the founding era, the Revolution and the Constitution stand as as kind of heroic examples of what the country is supposed to be about, and operates, therefore, as just a kind of a bellwether of what our culture is.
Well, so in what sense, for example, can we find free enterprise in our founding documents? Is that really something that we should be a free enterprise-based nation that's based on what our founding fathers said, or what they believed, or what they meant, or what they intended?
Well, I think the big issue there would be, how do you read the Commerce Clause? A historian or lawyer would say it's hard to talk about general principles without also having a specific text in mind. So the great controversy in 20th century and on into the 21st century jurisprudence is, but also with some significant 19th century antecedents, is what do we mean by commerce? One of the most notable things that the Constitution of 1787 did was to give the national government, to give Congress in particular, a general power to regulate commerce with overseas nations, commerce among the states, and with the Indians. And so what you mean by commerce really matters.
But can't we distinguish a couple different things, though? What the Constitution allows, I suppose that the Constitution would allow the federal government to provide for interstate commerce in almost whatever way it wanted. If it wanted to be the sole provider of health care, if it wanted to be the sole provider of, certain kinds of foods, I suppose the Constitution would allow states to decide that the state of California is going to be the sole provider of some good, right, within California's borders. If the good people of California wanted to do that and didn't want gas to be a market commodity, they could decide that within their state. I suppose the Constitution would allow that, but
no, not really. Because
it wouldn't.
Well, again, it comes back to what you mean by commerce. The federal government works on us in a couple interesting ways, and this may be more legal than philosophical. One is there is the question of how do you define commerce, how narrowly or expansively. Right. Historically, it meant really in the 19th century, say commerce is primarily about the movement of goods. And any number of other activities that the government might moderate regulate wouldn't qualify. Since the New Deal, since the 1930s, that definition was abandoned.
If a state decides it wants to provide education for its citizens, private right. things can't come along and say, but that's free enterprise. But now I take it that besides what the Constitution allows, there's sort of the ethos of the people and what laws could stand a chance of being passed. I assume that the framers left a lot up to the sort of political deliberation of the people,
No,
right?
yeah.
So that the Constitution constrains a bunch of things that the government can't do or must do, but it doesn't constrain all forms of our shared life.
Right. Well, that's in some ways that's what we call federalism, because federalism creates a situation where the people can act on whichever level of government they think is going to be most conducive. They can act on the states. They can act on the national government.
But that leads me to think that not everything that the founding fathers think is proper for our nation to be, or they thought it was was enshrined in the in these founding documents, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
not even they thought that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, there's some framers I think who see this really clearly. The one who I always think this context comes most to mind is a guy named James Wilson from Pennsylvania, who looks at the federal system and says, look, over the long run, what's really going to matter is which level of government is going to satisfy the people most.
So let me ask a question that you won't be able to answer, lead into our next segment. But to what extent, in terms of free enterprise, did our founding fathers have any alternatives in mind? I mean, in a sense, to say that they thought we should be free enterprise rather than socialist or communist presupposes that they could have those thoughts. Well, they had Hume, and they had Adam Smith, but did they really have these choices in mind?
But you're gonna have to think about that one for a bit, because you're listening to Philosophy Talk. Our subject today is meaning and the revolution. Our guest is Jack Rakove, author of Revolutionaries: A New History of the Invention of America.
And we'll continue our conversation in just a minute.
Talking about a revolution, oh no. Talking about a revolution,
Oh, we're not talking about any old revolution, and probably not about the one Tracy Chapman was singing about. We're talking about the American Revolution, and we're talking about the meanings of the words in the Declaration of Independence and the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution, too. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor, and this is Philosophy Talk. And our guest is Pulitzer Prize winning author Jack Rakove. His latest book is Revolutions: A New History of the Invention of America.
And I asked Jack just before the break a question about what sense does it make to say that the Founding Fathers had free enterprise system in mind? Because did they really have any alternatives? Had they heard of socialism, communism? I don't suppose they had, because Marx hadn't lived yet. So when we ask these questions, how should we think of this?
Well, I think there are two ways to think about it. One is the general supposition was that most economic activity would be launched by private individuals, mostly either as individual merchants or in fairly limited partnerships. But, and this is an important qualifier, at the time of the Revolution and in the decades immediately afterwards, governments, mostly at the state level but also at the national level, did undertake to organize corporations, for purposes of banking, for purposes of transportation, some for purposes of manufacturing, and so on. And those corporations represented an effort on the part of the state, meaning both the states but also potentially the national government, to be able to mobilize and direct resources to build infrastructure and to perform key functions.
Yeah, but then in those days they were limited with limited charter and all that stuff, and then sometime after the Civil War, the Constitution was interpreted in such a way, the 14th Amendment was interpreted so that corporations had the rights of persons, at least some of the rights of persons, and I believe that's a point in history in which a monster was created, to tell you the truth. I mean, the old corporation that these guys conceived is a lot different from the new corporation of the 21st century. Don't you think that's
Well,
right?
that's true, but Ken, that's also one way of saying, come back to your original question, that's one way of illustrating how the nature of language is inherently dynamic, and that the meaning of commerce, for that matter, of corporations changes. What happens with corporations is, in the 18th century, the idea of having a corporation means the government gives a grant to private individuals to perform a function which will be profitable to them, but will also fulfill some vital public purpose. And then in the 19th century, what happens is people start resenting the monopolistic notion of a corporation, and our laws of incorporation become much more liberal,
Right.
meaning that if the three of us want to form a corporation and we meet a certain standard, it doesn't matter whether the state approves us or not. We've qualified and we can go ahead and take our risks.
Right. So the whole I totally agree with you. Well, I'm going to ask our listeners, what does the American Revolution mean to you? Does the philosophy of the Founding Fathers affect your daily life? And does appealing to their sense of revolution appeal to you too, like the Tea Party folks? Or is their experience too removed from contemporary America to be accepted at face value, to be relevant to our lives.
Yeah, if you think the colonists were justified in their revolution, what would the same standards tell you today? How about the Basques? Do they have grievances that were as bad as these? But at any rate, join the conversation. The number is 415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134. You can also email us at comments@philosophytalk.org.
So, Jack, we've been talking at a kind of a practical level for a while, but one of the visions people have of the founding fathers is great political thinkers and visionaries and theorists. Did the founding fathers really share a philosophical vision? Is the Constitution, for example, a Lockean document, a Christian? I mean, what is it? Were they really deep philosophical thinkers, as we like to think of them as, or were they mostly practical men, or were they both of these things?
I would say both. The ones who play a leading role in the constitutional debates, the kind of guys I tend to study, and I always describe James Madison as my alter ego, so that's one place to begin. Were deeply read, and I think they were deeply reflective, and I'm impressed by their knowledge of the deep philosophical background. Of course, you don't want to just say philosophy. I mean, it's not just Locke and Hobbes and Montesquieu, as important as they are as reference points, because there are multiple vocabularies of how people talk about politics. There's history, there's common law tradition, there's the debates of 18th century Britain. So all these things kind of come together in that way.
But you think it's correct to say that they had a sort of shared, I'll call it philosophical, but in this broader sense that you mean, right? They had a shared kind of philosophical outlook on what democracy should be like. How would you describe
Well,
that?
I wouldn't say democracy, but I'd say something more like balanced government would be the phrase. So yes, I agree that they're deeply read, and some sources are valued more than others. Some are controversial. David Hume, and I used to study in the David Hume Square in Edinburgh when I was an undergraduate at one point. Hume is a somewhat controversial figure. Jefferson hates him. Hamilton loves him. Madison was probably influenced by him. But the other thing I want to say is that in addition to thinking about their intellectual background, which raises a great set of questions, the most important thing that a historian like myself would want to stress is that they were engaged in ongoing political deliberations in an extremely intense way, maybe from 1765 and the Stamp Act on, certainly from the mid-1770s on to 1787. So the question of how you balance what they read and what they understood and how they reacted to Montesquieu on the one hand with what they were thinking and doing in practice, I think is one of the really interesting questions about them.
Well, now Greg Slater, who's emailed us from East Palo Alto, takes a slightly different view here, kind of a refreshingly different view.
Oh, that's great. He does that a lot.
He says, "Hello, philosophy brothers. In the interest of questioning everything, including the intelligence of the Supreme Court, I question our obsession with the Founding Fathers. The constitutions were infants when it comes to understanding the rights of men, what a good democracy should be, justice. Even if they were geniuses, which I doubt, they were still immature, self-serving, slave-holding elitists." Well, not all of them, but the one you mentioned, Madison, I think was. "For God's sakes, who had more in common with the elites of Europe than the ignorant masses they ruled over? The Constitution was a first rough attempt by people from 200 years ago. It's almost certain that they got it wrong."
Actually, it was the second rough attempt because they had the Articles of Confederation. What do you say to Greg?
Well, there's a lot I can say to Greg. I mean, for one thing, look, much of what happens with the Constitution, it is about interpretation, and interpretation is an ongoing process, and so on. On the other hand, this is what distinguishes American constitutionalism. It is about as you guys said at the top of the hour, it is about the interpretation of particular texts. Those texts have a history.
I think Greg's point is something deeper than this, and I recall reading some from your earlier book, and I think you addressed this kind of. Look, the Constitution is a highly imperfect document, and some of them knew it was a highly imperfect document, but they were the Confederation was on the verge of collapse, and they had to make this thing together. And if you compare the Constitution, the ringing words of the Declaration, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, and shocking the conscience of man or something like that, and all this stuff. When you compare the Constitution to that thing, and not just the Constitution, but the reality of slavery and, forgive me, but but the Senate, that anti-democratic thing. And you think, oh, how did these guys think of it? Look, the slavery thing tore the nation apart in a few decades. And weren't they smart enough to see that they could deal with it? I think the Constitution's imperfect because they had to get this thing together, right? And it was a political compromise. It wasn't just a soaring Enlightenment document, a clarion call to equality and justice and all that. It was a complicated document.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, it's the outcome of a political process, which is like most political processes, is trying to serve multiple purposes. I mean, the framers did talk about having the kinds of big rhetorical statements of rights that had accompanied the first 8 constitutions a decade earlier, and they decided that was mostly redundant. And that's also different from saying, should there be a cruel and unusual restriction on cruel and unusual punishment? If you look at the early declarations of rights, they're full of statements of principle. And the framers said, that's fine for the moment of revolution, but the moment of revolution is past, and we actually have a more immediate, more focused set of issues that we want to deal with.
Or another way you could look at it is the Declaration of Independence was written by a bunch of guys who thought their biggest problem in life was tax on tea and stuff like that.
Not exactly, John.
And the Constitution was written by a bunch of guys who slogged through a war and had to get along with each other and found out that this government deal that they were taking for granted isn't so easy.
Yeah.
So we've got callers on the line. You can join this conversation by calling 415-841-4134 or send us email at comments@philosophytalk.org. And we'd love to have you be a member of this conversation. We count our audience as a second guest on this show. And Holly in San Francisco is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Holly.
Hello. In your introduction, you mentioned Scalia and how he tends to take the Constitution very literally. But a few years ago, Jeffrey Nunberg, our local linguist, did a piece on NPR saying that he had looked into Scalia's references and that he in fact uses 4 or 5 different dictionaries to come up with the literal meaning of the Constitution. So the implication was that he looks until he finds one that agrees with what he wants it to say. So I just wanted to mention that as far as how difficult it is to interpret the Constitution.
Scalia is actually very slippery on this, and if you look carefully at his opinion in the D.C. versus Heller case, which was the Second Amendment case from Washington, D.C. from 2 years ago, Scalia takes a whole bunch of 19th century definitions and 19th century interpretations and simply kind of plugs them back into the 18th century and says, well, what they thought in the 19th century must have been what they thought then. He does something similar. He traces the ways in which the language protecting the right to bear arms in the state constitutions actually changed from the late 18th into the 19th century, and says even though the language changed, it always meant the same thing.
Oh, that's really tricky. So if you could do that with the
19th
that's
century,
the
least it's
I know
downright devious.
I know. Well, here's the principle. If you can do that with the 19th century, why can't you do it with the 20th century use of the words? I mean, cruel and unusual means something now that it didn't maybe, and you say, well, whatever it means now is what it must. Why can't you do it like that?
Well, but we would say what it means now is what it means to us, but Scalia is doing something which is more devious, which is saying what it meant in the 19th century is also what it meant in the 18th.
This is a question that often puzzles me about constitutional interpretation. Is there anywhere in the Constitution that says how it is to be interpreted? I can't find anywhere.
No.
Right?
In fact, the last chapter of my original meetings books, my original meetings book from 1996 talks about the invention of interpretation, and the whole idea there is since the idea of interpreting a written Constitution as binding law was a novelty that came along with the revolution, we can't be immediately sure that they knew what the rules of interpretation would be.
Well, let me just ask you about that novelty. Now we have a written constitution. Britain famously, and I suppose accurately, does not. And yet they're pretty good at protecting the rights of their citizens. I mean, maybe they're a little more tolerant of inhibiting freedom of press and so forth and so on. But by and large, it's hard for me to make out the claim that if we didn't have that stuff written down, everything would just go to Hades in a handbasket. I mean, is it really a good idea to have a written constitution?
In one sense, it's a function of necessity. That's to say, if you're coming out of a revolutionary situation in 1776 or the kind of collapse of the national government in 1787, you can't simply start up a government de novo without writing it down and saying this is what it's going to do. Mm-hmm. The other way to think about this, though, John, more to your point, is there is this interesting set of questions about the Bill of Rights, which is does not figure very prominently. That's to say, the first 10 amendments or the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, however you want to count them, which really don't figure all that prominently in American jurisprudence much before the late 19th century, and yet much of the basis for the kind of liberal society that we still think we're inhabiting was obviously being worked out and and developed and practiced, particularly at the state level. Before then.
415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134. You can email us at comments@philosophytalk.org. And we've got Reed from San Francisco on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Reed. Give us your comment or question briefly, please.
Hi, I'd like to ask the professor how the concept of family or the reality of family and family values fit into the Constitution, if at all. Is that something that maybe was an omission? I don't think it's even mentioned.
Well, right. It's not mentioned. I don't know if I want to say it's an omission, but the original understanding from the late 18th century would be that the governance of family was entirely a matter for state law, and the states had an enormous latitude legislatively in terms of saying what the various rights of the different members and of a family would be.
So when you say it was a matter for state law, so did the framers explicitly think that all the things not mentioned by the federal in the Constitution's powers of the federal governments or limits on what the federal governments could do were left to state governments?
Yeah,
or
essentially.
What about the free people and unregulated by any kind of government?
Well, I think it's one of our biggest misunderstandings. I mean, if you think about the nature of governance in the 18th century, the states, in a certain sense, like Parliament, had what we would call plenary authority. That's to say, there was no object of human activity where their legislative authority could not reach. So if you want to envision America as a kind of libertarian paradise, that's kind of problematic.
So when we talk about limited government, so the Republicans are big fans of limited government, and they find inspirations in that from the Founding Fathers. What they really mean is limited federal powers, but the Founding Fathers had no particular constraints until the 14th Amendment comes along, I guess, on what state governments could do. Is that right?
Yeah, although actually you do want to make one exception. I mean, I think the chief constraint is, and it goes back to something we said towards the top of the hour, the chief constraint is on religion. That's to say, I think that the acceptance of freedom of conscience or free exercise of religion, however we want to characterize it, did represent a significant shift in not just in American, but in Western concepts of governance. But in all the other areas, regulation of the economy, regulation of the family, regulation of community life, local and state governments were highly empowered.
So let me end with a brief question we've got from the email, because I really like it, particularly the first part. Hi, you guys. Great program and a terrific show. What if the Founding Fathers had included the Founding Mothers? That's what Sally asked. Would America have included our input in every decision?
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're discussing meaning and the revolution. Our guest is Jack Rakove, author of Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America.
Well, why does it matter what the Founding Fathers thought? They didn't stay awake at night worrying about our problems. Why should we worry about their opinions?
We'll continue our conversation when Philosophy Talk continues.
Will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
The American Revolution wasn't televised. It wasn't even on the radio. It wasn't even on the telegraph. It's amazing it happened at all. But we can certainly talk about the meaning on this radio station. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. We're discussing meaning of the revolution. Our guest is Pulitzer Prize winning author Jack Rakove, author of Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America.
So Jack, we ended the last segment with this question from Sally via email about the role of women or the lack of role of women among the Founding Fathers. There weren't any Founding Mothers. Let's put that in a slightly larger context. These were Enlightenment documents, Enlightenment folks, and the Enlightenment, not everybody thinks was the greatest thing that ever happened. The Enlightenment was basically, the privileged people's idea of things. No women, no slaves, no laborers. I mean, are you a big fan of the Enlightenment?
Although its official theory was, the equal humanity of all men and reason and all that stuff, what's up with that?
Well, first off, I am a big fan of the Enlightenment, and whatever that means, if it's okay for Locke and for Jefferson, it's usually pretty good for me.
Just for my own part, I wish I lived back then. When philosophers didn't have to know all that mathematics and were taken seriously. Of course, people did throw their did empty their bin pads out the fourth-story windows.
Well, Jefferson was pretty good at math, actually. So look, from a modern perspective, was that era as democratic as ours is? Did it value the views of the people en bloc or en masse as much as we do? Well, probably not. I think for the American perspective, though, it's there's a number of healthy developments. Women, we know this from kind of what the social historians have done. Women have a deep sense of involvement in the revolution, and the question of whether or not they voted. Voting in the 18th century wasn't always that big a deal. Voting matters when you really have contested elections. But if you don't have contested elections, it may not be quite as consequential as we think it was. So women, I think, felt deeply involved. And a number of groups who may have fallen short of the property requirements, we see this particularly in states like Pennsylvania. From 1776 on, the working classes become much more assertive. The Americans were conscious of this when they have conventions to ratify the Constitution. Federal Constitution 1787, 1788, they tend to lower the property requirements of those who vote for the delegates.
So look, the thing that from my youth, my rebellious youth, I've always loved about America was not so much the actual messy history of the place, right, and the messy history of exclusion and all this stuff and the battles. But
messy history makes work for a story.
Yeah, I know that's good. But what I loved was the articulation in these founding documents of stirring ideals, because that gave you something to hold America to. Right. And that's I think that's a grand thing, and I think of the history of America as partly as excluded people and their allies trying to hold America to its real commitments. And I think that's a grand thing. But there's a deeper criticism that these sort of postmodern folks make of these Enlightenment ideas. So there's one kind of criticism. America was never true to itself. But there's another kind of criticism that goes in some ways deeper, although I don't really share it, but I just want to put it on the table, that the emphasis on individualism and autonomy rather than collectivity and all that stuff, right, has made America in some ways a kind of distorted place, because we're kind of isolated people. The reason the public square in America is so diminished is because we don't like collective solutions, and that's imbued in the very ethos of what the country is. And some people who want to take the country back see this individualism and all that under threat by collectivism, and they think it's bad. But the people who want us to be more like a European democracy see the individualism and the isolation as what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, Ken. The extent to which it comes out of the documents, as opposed to coming out of some other more fundamental or more essential forces in the society, that's a tough one to answer shortly. Look, you could start by speculating simply. If you take a society like 18th century America, which is still essentially huddled along the Atlantic seaboard after a century and a half, and then you open up the West, and then you first the Middle West, and then you open up other Wests till eventually you get to California and even Hawaii, and let's mention Alaska, so much in the news, for better or for worse in recent years. So there's any of a number of conditions about life in the society which are probably encouraging of individualism. Let's go back to something I said earlier. It's hard for the state, if you have a society expanding this way, it was really hard for the state to control economic development if in the first place that means authorizing things like bridges, turnpikes, canals, railroads, et cetera, because every community wants to compete with every other community. There has to be some limit to how much support the state as a whole could give, and that encourages a lot of quasi-public, quasi-private, increasingly private activities to take over.
Let me ask you a kind of a historical question. One Enlightenment figure, or almost Enlightenment figure, we don't hear much about is Rousseau. Now, Hume and Rousseau were for a while friends. Hume gave Rousseau a place to live when he was in trouble, and then Rousseau, who was kind of nutty, turned against him. Yeah. But Rousseau has a bit different take on things. Maybe didn't seem so different in the 1700s. It really seems different now, where we trace lots of 20th century things back to Rousseau. Did he have any influence? Had these guys read him? Had they heard of him?
I think if you have read him, my sense is Rousseau was. I think Rousseau is certainly known. I don't think he's carefully read. I don't think he has very much influence in America. I don't think he has much influence on the political side. If I had to come up with a more or less contemporary French figure, Montesquieu, to some extent Voltaire would seem to be much more influential sources.
I want to ask you a question that maybe it's not the right to ask a historian. Maybe I should be asking a sociologist or something like that. But in the news recently is all this stuff about that mosque in New York and all this anti-Muslim fervor. Do you think Americans in their hearts of hearts are still fully committed, or were we ever fully committed to these stirring ideals, of equality, liberty, religious tolerance? So are we still the America of old in our guts?
Well, fully committed means 100%. There are other episodes you'd have to look back to. That's to say, think about the history of the Mormons, or think about some of the early reactions against the Catholic Church, which were deeply seated in
Right.
in Protestant culture. On the other hand, I'm a Madisonian, and in terms of my scholarship, and I think in a lot of ways in terms of my values, and I think Madison has, with you guys in the room, a deeply philosophical appreciation, which in some extent I think was shared by much of the culture about the importance of freedom of conscience. And not just freedom of conscience, but the free. There's a difference between freedom of conscience, the right to believe, and free exercise of religion.
I do believe that one of the things that is kind of distinctive about America is that we really do have a kind of ingrained philosophical outlook, whether it's fully articulated, and that America is part of what it is because we do believe in individual liberty, and it's kind of deep in our souls. But I just wonder if the whole package, equality, tolerance, is still there in any large measure. I think it's being eroded, and this recent stuff just troubles me deeply because I think we're becoming un-America, as it were.
Right, because it's deeply troubling. Look, I mean, I certainly agree on the New York question, without doubt.
Okay, well, on that note of agreement, I'm going to thank you for joining us. It's been a wonderful and scintillating conversation. Thanks a lot.
Well, my pleasure to be here.
Our guest has been Jack Rakove, professor of history and American studies at Stanford University, author of Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America. So, John, you got any final thoughts?
Yeah, my final thoughts I'm going to put in the form of a limerick. It's nice to have founding fathers, but sometimes they're just nagging bothers. Why should some dead yahoo back a century or two decide whether we do this, that, or the others?
Well,
so what do you think of that?
Well, I think that's profound, John. That's what I think.
Well,
but you know what? I really enjoyed this show. I really enjoyed talking to Jack. This was the scintillating stuff. I think that last thing. I wish we could have talked about more about whether we still believe in our founding sort of political philosophy. But you know what? This conversation continues as always on our blog, the blog. .philosophytalk.org, where our motto is Cogito Ergo Blogo. I haven't written a blog on this one yet, but I'm going to write a blog on this one because I have lots and lots of thoughts to share on this topic.
And you can download podcasts of our program from our website as well.